Dangerously Close. My guest today is Neda Toloui-Semnani. Neda is an Emmy Award-winning producer, reporter, and author. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, including The Cut, The Intercept, Vice News, The Washington Post, and so many more. Her first book, They Said They Wanted Revolution, a memoir of my parents from Little A Publications, was published in 2022. What's up, Neda?
What's up? Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. I'm so happy to talk to you. Actually, I was just about to say, I think I had sent you a message kind of like wondering where I might go, because I told you I was reading your book.
Yeah.
And, when I first started talking to you about coming on the podcast, I had mentioned that we would maybe talk about They Said They Wanted Revolution, which is a story about your parents, the Iranian Revolution, how the revolution affected you and your family, activism across generations, and obviously a lot more than that. But also right now, you're reporting on the protests in Iran, which has become one of the biggest news stories in the world that's unfolding as we speak. So I thought we could jump around from the past to the present and just see where that takes us, if that's cool with you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, okay. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, we could go on so long just talking about your book, but also I don't want to skip over what's happening right now in the reporting you're doing right now.
Yeah.
But to kind of kick it off with some action, can you share the story of escaping Iran with your mother when you were a child?
Sure. Yeah, so it was in July 1982. It was kind of like any other day from what I understand. My mom had gone to work in the morning, and then she had gone to pick me up from daycare, preschool or something. And then we were going, like, I guess we did most days, to have lunch at my grandmother's house, and my dad was going to meet us there, and he never showed up. And so what my dad, who had been political, and we had been sort of living underground in a safe house, he when he didn't show up, my mother started freaking out. And then we come to find out that he was arrested. And it was just by chance that my mother and I weren't taken, that we ended up going back to where we lived when my dad and the Revolutionary Guards came to my grandmother's house. So it really was just chance. And then my dad was able to get a message to my mother when she called the house, or my grandmother's house, later that day, to sort of be like, has anyone seen him? Has he come? And my aunt picked up the phone and told her, take the kids and drop them at your mother's house and then come here. And that was code to leave, because my grandmother, lived in California. My mother at the time was 7 months pregnant, almost 8 months pregnant. And we ended up going underground, like truly underground, for about 3 to 4 weeks while they found smugglers to get us out of the country. And then we went over the border, and I go into this in some detail in the book, but we went over the border of Iran into Turkey. It's a smuggling route that is sort of well-known smuggling routes, and it's still being used now. So, it's, entirely relevant if you are at all interested.
And I know you mentioned this in the book, but I'm not sure if we brought it up, but you were like basically a baby or a toddler. So
yeah, I was.
In addition to your mother being 7, 8 months pregnant. So this is like probably the most difficult way to travel.
I know.
under the best circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. There were 6 of us, I think. I think it was 6, who left together. And one of us was me, who was not even 3 years old yet. And then another one was my cousin, who was 5 months old. And and then my mother was very, very pregnant. And then, everybody else was, and then the other thing is, so we went over the mountains and it was horseback and by foot and by car a bit until we got into Turkey. And then that was a whole ordeal to get, my mother and I had probably the easiest time of getting out of the country. Though it was still hard because we had American citizenship, but the rest of the family ended up sort of being forced to go longer routes to get back to the States. And so, yeah, I mean, I now have he'll be 2 in the spring, in March. And I truly don't know I don't know how they did it. Like
Yeah.
the infant was one thing, but having a toddler who, yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know how they did it. Truly.
And I know that you wrote a lot of the book, partially it's memory, but a lot of it is the stories of your relatives, people who are there, and people that have just told the story so many times. So that's how a lot of it's formed. But do you have, I know that you were very, very young, but do you have any like memories that are your own of that trip?
The journey. No, no, when I was younger, I mean, it's so hard to know what is, memory can be created and recreated. So it's hard to know what's memory and what's not. But I think, one of the things that I really did a lot of research on was sort of childhood trauma and childhood, like how children store memory, because I always had like, it was almost like I was remembering feelings or sensations. There was like 2 very clear, like feeling emotion memories I had. One of them was feeling very much like I wanted to be with my mother and not understanding why I couldn't. And we were traveling by like pack horse at night. And so there literally, she was very pregnant. Plus the horses had like our stuff on it. And so, most of us were traveling on the horses with the smugglers because it was dark, because we were at night, and these are like pretty dangerous, some of the most dangerous smuggling routes in the world, like physically dangerous.
Yeah.
So, obviously, maybe not obviously, but it would have been dangerous for me to be with her. Also, she probably like physically didn't have enough room for me, but my little baby brain didn't quite understand that. And so I remember feeling that she was mad or like I was in trouble somehow.
Yeah.
And so that's one feeling that's sort of hard to describe, but that's something that like really stayed with me. And then the other one was I had a very clear memory of not liking my smuggler. But also I had this like, it was like a security blanket. It was a blue windbreaker that I would suck my thumb and hold. And I fell asleep. And while I was falling asleep, my hand loosened. And I very clearly remember waking up and it having like floated away
Oh
down
yeah.
the side of the mountain, or cliff top, or yeah. And that was like a really big deal in my life because they stopped and sort of looked for it and they couldn't find it. And I remember and this is, it's so hard to know, but I remember seeing it and being like, we have to, like, I know where it is. Let me go. I can find it. But we had to keep going. And I was terrified. Those are like the 2 big memories I have of the journey. And then when I was reporting the story, because you're right, a lot of it was reporting. Like, I mean, I sat down with people and asked them questions. But a lot of it also was, I went back to like the city. So I was able to like check where I could people's memories and my own. So when I was in Istanbul, I went to, for example, the Hilton there, and that's where we stayed one night or 2 nights or something. I forget, but we stayed there for between for I don't know, a few days. Because that's where my uncle who came to get us, he ended up getting us space there. So it was really interesting walking through, walking up to that hotel and all of a sudden feeling like I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't been back there, obviously. And um, that was when I was like not even 3. And then I was going back there when I was 38. And I just remembered, like, I remember the ceilings there. I remember the pool. Like, I remembered various
Oh,
parts.
wow. So it
Yeah,
was it
it
was familiar
totally,
to you?
yeah. I mean,
That's
well,
crazy.
so there's like this turquoise tiled roof when you're walking in. And I don't know, it was just something that like blew my mind. Like I called my aunt who had been on the journey with us and I was like, this is crazy. And I like sent her a picture and I just, you know, it was just moments like that where I was really interested in what kind of details would stick out to me. And then that was, I mean, kind of each part along the way where I could, I tried to go back to like different places and see, how much my memory or other people's memories kind of lined up with documents and archives and facts.
The memory of losing the blue jacket and it like falling down a mountain into a ravine, that
Mhm.
resonates with me, just the way my memory worked for from my childhood when I was that age and really young. All my
Yeah.
memories from that time period, it's difficult to describe, but they're kind of like either like a photograph or like a really short like TikTok. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like just or what are they? Do you say GIF or GIF? I don't. I know that
I say
there's.
GIF,
I
but
say GIF
I
too.
I don't judge people that say GIF. I get confused.
I prefer GIF, so I'm going to go with that. And I was going
Yeah.
to say that a lot of that's probably the best description of memories like from around 3 years old is a lot like a GIF,
Yeah.
and and there might be an emotion attached to it, maybe not, but so that memory really like feels like to me like I'm like, yeah, I know exactly what that's like, just
Yeah.
the jacket floating away.
Yeah. Exactly. And it was interesting. When I was doing research, because I was trying to figure out like, well, how do you, the trick of writing like any book, but a book when you are either a toddler through parts of it or aren't alive is like
Yeah.
how do you and these are stories that you've been told since you were a kid. So like how do you tell it without like both as an adult, but like preserving some of that childhood. And then like also you're parsing through a lot of memories that don't really, yeah, they're not logical. You have to, so one of the interesting things was like finding like actually being like, of course, children don't have words. So they store memory in their body in different ways. And they have um yeah, it would make sense that there'd be sense memories rather than like verbal memories
And
because
I guess
words.
I kind of asked you to jump right into, well, I mean, it kind of makes sense. It's the part of the story that you remember or that you were there for. But I guess I should ask you to maybe tell why you were in Iran and why you were escaping. And it's because your parents met at Berkeley, and
Mm-hmm.
they were students. They, presumably, I would assume that they were enjoying living in the Bay Area, but I don't know, maybe, but why,
I
why,
mean, it was the
why did they
60s,
choose?
man.
I mean, yeah, that's what I'm saying. The 60s in the Bay Area sounds like a pretty nice place to be. And I was curious why they would leave, also just like the relative safety of California to go to Iran during what was really a tumultuous time because there was a revolution that was coming.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, my parents, my mom came to the States when she was a kid, when she was 10, so in the mid to late 50s. And then my dad came when he was 18, he came to Missouri. And then, so my mom had basically grown up in California. She'd grown up in sort of the Central Coast, and she had always felt sort of like an outsider. She was like quiet and bookish, and my dad probably felt very out of place in Missouri. I've that's sort of the part of his life I know the least about. Um, but I know that once they met at Berkeley, it was both this like, it was sort of a coming of age for both of them. They found their place in a political movement, which was the anti-Shah movement. They met at the end of the 60s. So it was a time of like, if you've seen anything about the 60s, I think it was less 60s, probably in more 70s politics rather than like 60s um, sort of music and drugs and like free love. That wasn't their vibe, man. Their vibe was like politics, and they considered themselves eventually revolutionary,
Yeah.
which like was not different from what was happening at Berkeley. Like and for a lot of the country, I think, one of the things I tried to bring into the book was like we forget because we're not, I don't think, taught about how radical the 70s, especially the early 70s were.
Yeah.
And so they were very much of a time period, and they were part of a leftist movement that was very much of the time, and not just in the US, but across, Europe. And so they worked from 69 until 79 to basically, they wanted the Shah of Iran gone, but that's not just what they were working for.
Yeah.
So they were very much leftists, and they were very much against this very specific monarchy, which was a controversial monarchy, especially as you were going through the 70s, or a controversial monarch as you're going through the 70s. Um, and so they went back, they had worked very hard. They were behind a lot of big protests, or like participated in a lot of big demonstrations against the Shah. They worked, you know, around, they went abroad to work against him. And then eventually after he went into exile in January 1979, had already been planned, but my parents went back in 79 to sort of participate in the revolution. Now it was safe for them to go back since it had been illegal to be a part of some of the political movements that they were a part of. So they weren't able to go back to Iran up until then. So they went back to Iran as soon as they could. And that's, I was born in 79. So a true child of the revolution. There's, a generation of us that were born then. And, very quickly, it didn't quite pan out the way that they had thought it would, or even those early days of the revolution suggested it would.
Yeah.
So yeah, so my mom became less political the longer they were in Iran, because she was more like preoccupied with her family and trying
Yeah.
to make a living. But for my dad, he never really left his political work.
It's kind of my understanding is that the Iranian Revolution began very democratic in nature, and people were trying to depose a monarch, like you said. But what had happened was that, and also just correct me if I'm like, obviously I'm not a scholar on this, but
You're not.
that there was like a little bit of a power vacuum, and a lot of the right-wing extremists in the country were well organized and were able to kind of assert themselves into power, and that's how you ended up with the regime that started 40 years ago we have today. Is that kind of a fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good summary, basically. I think, the overthrow was a coalition of different groups. But as you said, there was a very clear leader. And, politics is politics.
Yeah.
So a lot of people made compromises. And then you have a certain group take power, take control, and then really spend the next few years consolidating and control. So, my book doesn't get into that. My work sort of research and whatever expertise I have doesn't go too far into that. But there are plenty of really interesting books from various kind of views, and I would encourage people who are interested. I think Iran is a really fascinating microcosm of um, what it means to be forced for a revolution to happen and then to rebuild. And I say this because Iran is also in the midst of what I believe is the first few months of a revolution now.
Yeah, and I think honestly, you just said so many things that I want to address almost everything you just said. But I'm going to try and go one by one. So I'll start with just like the reason why I brought up what I was saying about right-wing extremists coming in. So there was a democratic revolution. However, the wrong people kind of, or, you know, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion, the wrong people got in charge. And it seemed like in a lot of ways, you know, one of the people that lost the most in this were the women of Iran. Like, they lost their rights. And then, of course, in your own family, because your father remained active in politics and was in opposition, he ended up being arrested by this regime, and then you had to flee.
Yeah. And not, you know, I mean, I think, that's all true. I mean, I think the extremists are, when there's a power vacuum, people tend to go towards certainty, I think. And, you know, I'm certainly not an academic, so I'm sure people have much smarter and more theoretical responses to it, or deeply based in theory. But my sense is, from my reporting and research, that people don't love instability, which makes sense, right? And so, but yeah, I mean, I think the thing about being a woman, or being somebody who identifies as a woman, being anybody who's in the minority, you often find your rights. Somebody will say, well, let's worry about everybody else, and then we'll deal with, I mean, obviously, you guys will eventually have the rights that you deserve, but like, let's just make sure everybody else can eat first.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, it's always, I think that's the hardest part, is the stuff people are willing to give away in the name of overall safety. And I will say, Iranian women didn't give their rights away. It was, they fought almost from the jump to retain their rights. So yeah, I mean, I think Iranian women, kind of generally speaking, have been one of the most active political groups, and certainly in the country. But they have worked for more than a century to both work towards some sort of democratic system, and then work to have their rights respected and recognized.
Yeah, and in no way was I trying to diminish anything that the Iranian women have been doing over the past 40 years. I was just, you know, all I was saying is that, you know, it was sad that the people that did take power decided, you know, to have the kind of to be oppressive towards women in the way they have been. But what we could say, I guess. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I mean, just to be clear, I didn't take that as
okay.
Yeah. No, I was just, I don't think many people know, like, the history of women's political movements in Iran. So just for your listeners.
So I guess so we can move into what more people will know about now, because this is, I mean, I would, if I was going to say the two biggest international news stories right now is the Russian war and the Iranian protest / maybe revolution. That's really what my question is, because what we were talking about, essentially the same regime that we've been talking about this whole time has still been in power for the past 40 years, But in September 2022, Masa Amini was abducted by the morality police and died in their custody a few days later, which sparked a massive women-led protests across the entire country of Iran in every city, and it continues to gain momentum and power. And most news sources are still reporting on this as it's protests. That's like the kind of the language they're using. But you just mentioned this a little while earlier, and something I did want to ask you. Do you think that this could be categorized as a new revolution? Is that a fair way to say it?
I think so. And I think a lot of, a few people have asked me why I choose that language. And I think this isn't a protest. To me means that even if you want something changed, you're willing to work within the system to change it. And these are not that. These are people saying and not just the group of people who are out on the streets, like physically protesting, but everybody that I've spoken to inside of Iran, with like the exception of people that I personally haven't spoken to, but I know that they're like pro-regime people, but they're very small and seem to be very far and few between. At least this is my personal, experience. Not one person is saying, let's keep working within the systems that are there. In fact, what they're saying is that the systems are rotten, which is, what revolutionaries, what it means to be in revolution, to be in revolt, is to say that the system isn't working. Instead of reforming it, what we want to do is rebuild it, start from the beginning, for example. And I think that that's why I'm somebody who, considers the words I'm using pretty carefully. And I think out of respect for the people who are, as you say, putting themselves at risk of being abducted, since arrests don't really work. If you don't have a rule of law, you can't say that somebody's being arrested. Because then their release or their execution or their sentencing is sort of up to whomever is in the room at that time. It's up to the whim of whoever is in power. So then it's not a rule of law, as it were, in any real sense. This is but
it's a tyrant. Tyranny. Yeah.
Right. So if you can't say somebody was arrested if somebody is essentially abducted, right? And then like put in prison for months or whatever. And then so if you don't have a rule of law that is something that's easily sort of recognizable, and you don't have people who are saying we want to reform the system, and every time somebody leaves the house, whether or not you are, demonstrating, or if you're going to, try to catch a bus somewhere, every time you leave your house, you're at risk. That means to me that people are in some sort of revolt. It's a conflict anyway, and the people who are fighting, the people who are putting their lives at risk, are the people that I'm concerned about centering in this story. And so if what they're telling me is we consider this a revolution, then it's up to me to use the words that make sense. I mean, I think sometimes we play fast and loose with how we label things. I think about this with the insurrection a lot. People call that, depending on where you are, like they call it a riot or a protest, a far-right protest. But I'm very specific at calling it an insurrection because that's what it was. And I think it's, the same way. I just think we have to be very specific about the words that we choose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and I, not to go just too far in this direction, but I mean, it's facts and it can't be ignored. And that's that the Iranian regime is executing prisoners, and these are people who have been arrested for protesting. And so for people to continue to go out and protest when this this power structure has shown that they will essentially murder people, because this is not like these aren't people that were on death row because they were murderers. They're being executed for, freedom of expression, free
Yeah.
speech, essentially. It can't be really that much more clear cut that it is a revolution. And the people are, they're not just going out in places where they're not just on college campuses. They're going to some of the like most conservative religious centers in the country.
Yeah. I mean, I think I mean, I also think a couple of things that just want to reinforce of what you said. It's a women-led protest, but it's also a protest, a revolution. It's it's also a revolution that's based very firmly in rights issues that are about women's rights and minority rights, which is something
Yeah.
that we haven't really seen. So I think that's like I would just want to sort of stress the uniqueness. And then the people who are on the ground, they are fighting with, as you say, protests, but also through art, graffiti, music, theater. Like when we're talking about the full scope of freedom of expression, like that's what it is. It's freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. These are the tools that they are actually using to fight a ruthless totalitarian regime, and I think, and brutal. And so, and they're young. I think that's the
Yeah.
other thing, is that these are often kids, like in their teens and early 20s. So I don't think, I think like the full texture of it is both interesting and unique in that sense, but also um, that's what makes it so hard for so many of us to be witnessing.
And I don't want to start throwing out any statistics that I don't know for certain, but this is just something that I read, and it can be different by now. But I believe there's something. I mean, a lot of people have been killed, like not just in the executions, but people are getting killed in the protests by the police. And I saw somewhere it was something really, really dramatic that something like 25% of the people killed were children. Is that
And
sound like a correct number, or I could
I
be
don't,
wrong?
I mean, it both wouldn't surprise me. And also I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I do know,
And I know it's difficult for a lot of this information to get out of Iran right now. So I mean, we're working with what we're working with.
yeah, I mean, I think there's, I would, for people who are interested, I think Amnesty is keeping track of the numbers, and Iranian Human Rights Center, I believe. But like, I think what you're saying is actually another really, like, this is something that actually keeps me up at night, that there just isn't enough trusted news. Like nobody really is on the ground there. There's so many journalists right now that are in prison, mostly
Yeah.
women journalists, but so many journalists are in prison in Iran. Many more are working like I am, trying from the outside to get in to figure out what's happening, which means that there are so many stories that we don't know. We don't know the full, we can't even begin to understand the full extent of this moment.
I know that you had said earlier that you didn't make it a focus of your book to do a ton of research into the methods and practices that the regime used to solidify power in the 1980s,
Mhm.
and to like suppress political opposition. But you did do some, you did do some research, and you lived through it, and your family lived through it. So I know that
Mhm.
obviously you have a much more clear and personal experience with what that was.
Yeah.
But I guess my question really is, though, how different would you say, if at all, the methods and practices that the modern regime is using to suppress protesters are? Like, have they changed their tactics? Are they more sophisticated? Or
I mean, I think Iran, the regime, not the people of the Islamic regime, is incredibly sophisticated in terms of surveillance. It's a full-on surveillance state, and um, And that's something that cannot, you know, Iran, can hack. We have tons of stories over the past however many years, 10 years, doing whatever. But they also spent a lot of time in honing their skills and their technology by watching their own people and surveilling their own people. And the best, I will say, the most difficult part of living in a place where you don't know if you're always being watched is that you think that you're always being watched. So
Yeah.
you sort of change your behavior accordingly. Um, so that's, so in the sense of the technology, I think, you know, Iran is relatively sophisticated when it comes to surveillance. But that being said, I think, the playbook seems to me to be the same. They are still, whether they're stalking people online or in person, they're still stalking people. They're still abducting people. They're still disappearing people. They still practice, allegedly, they practice torture on prisoners. That certainly has been the case with people in my family and people that I know. Um, there isn't due process in the way there is, in America or in other countries. So I think, that's certainly true. I think what is the brutality feels of what's happening now, how they're clamping down now. It's always been an incredibly brutal regime, but like the brutality seems to me to be on par with what we saw in the 1980s. And that's just, the ferocity of how they're like, clamping down on people.
I don't want to like invoke the Third Reich as a reference, because right now everyone's calling everyone Nazis, and it's becoming a little bit meaningless. But I think in this instance, what I'm thinking about right now, it actually is a good metaphor, analogy, is the way. So obviously the Nazis did not have the kind of surveillance, the sophisticated surveillance that Iran has now, but they had the thing where like getting neighbors to snitch on neighbors, and having the Nazi youth to try and get kids to snitch on their teachers or their parents. And I guess what I'm thinking is, in a slightly different way, is the sophisticated ability of the propaganda arm of the regime to get various factions within Iran who might all benefit from a regime change, but by keeping them opposed to each other. Does that seem to be a problem?
Oh, that's interesting. I, that's a, I don't think, I'm certainly not, I don't know like a ton about I'm not an expert on Germany and in the lead up to World War II.
I shouldn't have even brought it up. It popped into my head, and then I couldn't help it. It came right out.
No. I mean, I don't get the sense. I don't know. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I don't know. But what do I think that the regime is exploiting divisions within the diaspora? Well, I don't. Okay, I'm gonna actually. I'm not gonna say anything because it's all my personal opinion, and I don't know.
That's totally
and I think
totally.
like
I want to know your opinion though, so feel free to just share your personal opinion.
Well, so one of the reasons why I'm hesitating on that, or maybe it's worth even explaining why I am, is I think there is, because we don't have a lot of information coming out of Iran, people are taking shreds of, it feels like conspiracy theories are just mushrooming. And
yeah,
I actually think that's becomes really dangerous in a moment like this, because then you're giving credence to other people's agendas are suddenly like foist upon you, and all of a sudden you're like, well, wow, that sounds right. And I don't even know if I'm making sense, but what I'm trying to say is that it's actually become really disheartening to see the level of finger pointing and conspiracy mongering that's happened since the start of the uprising. And I really, I don't know who is behind it, and I don't pretend to know who is behind it, but I can say that it's less about, from what I understand, neighbors snitching on neighbors to the government, for example. Um, though I don't know, and I can't pretend to know, but I don't think, I haven't heard of that. But I do think what's interesting in terms of like divisions are outside of the country. There seems to be a real movement to divide the diaspora in ways that I think are um, doesn't serve the overall mission
Yeah.
um, of supporting the people who are struggling inside the country. I think it's distracting from what's actually happening. And I think what's really frustrating to watch is well-meaning people pushing conspiracy theories.
And
And I'm not sure who it serves.
yeah, absolutely. So, uh, you know what I'll do? I'll rephrase that question and maybe like a little bit more of a more succinct
Okay.
way. That doesn't lend itself so much to just saying, are there secret police doing, because of course, how would you even know?
Yeah.
But you did just say, like you were talking about the diaspora, and and that makes me wonder, like you've been back to Iran since you were a child, right? You've been there as an adult.
Yes, I was there in 2003, 2004. So not recently, but
Well, I mean, I just wanted to ask, just as a woman, just
Mhm.
going to Iran, can you kind of say what is it like to be a woman in Iran, just in a day to day? Like, what's that feel
Yeah.
like?
I mean, I think, it was in 2003, 2004 was such an interesting time in Iran too. It was like as the country was starting to open up a little bit, the idea was that, things were getting a little bit looser. Um, there was this, all of a sudden people were, I remember before I got there, people were telling me, oh, they're like, Iran has the best parties, which isn't a lie. And girls are wearing makeup outside, and everybody has these really beautiful like hijabs and manteau, and like, you'll anyway, it was just, I remember being told that like it feels like it's opening. It felt like something was changing or starting to change.
Mhm.
Um, and then and in some ways that did feel true. But in many other ways, I found it really difficult. I, I was in my early 20s at that point, and I've told this story before, but um, I would, I was just, I just always felt very conscious of where I was in any given moment, or I would get really frustrated by the limitations on my movement. I got really annoyed when I would go for a run and I had to be covered. I would get really, really angry and hurt and mad when I would be commuting to work and I would have to sit in the back of the bus. Um, as a woman, like the women's section was at the back of the bus. I found it very difficult, I
Well,
think. And so,
that's crazy. That's like the segregate, like the United States segregation, like in the civil rights is.
oh yeah. And being an American, I found it very difficult because it wasn't, um, you couldn't move, like if it was too crowded and nobody was in the front of the bus, you couldn't move to the front of the bus. There was a steel rod that was separating the women's section. And I don't know if that's still how they do it, but at the time it was a steel rod separating the women's section from the men's section. And so you'd pay in the front of the bus and then you'd walk to the back of the bus, and it didn't, it felt like it never mattered what time of day it was. You were always squished together. And I found it humiliating,
Yeah.
and I found it really difficult to have grown up in the US with some knowledge of what the civil rights movement was and really like why what it meant to separate people. Um, and I mean, forget about separate but equal. They're just that wasn't my feeling. That wasn't my experience of both sides of the bus.
I mean,
And
there is no more clear cut way to say we believe men are superior to women. Women have to be on the shittier part of the bus. Like, and and if they're overcrowded, they can't move into the open part of the bus because this is enforced by law. I assume is that
right.
right?
Well, I
Yeah,
mean, and then there was no, I think the other thing that was so frustrating and was that it wasn't consistent, like so you can take these sort of taxis, these private taxis up and down um in central Tehran and like some of the big thoroughfares, you like flag down a taxi and you jump in. And then the men and the women would be squished together. And you'd be like, a man could be like on top of you, essentially.
yeah.
And that sort of inconsistency also was, it just made you sort of like the paranoia of living there and being a woman. Though I'm sure being a man too had its, being a man in Iran at that point also had its insanity inducing moments. I mean, there was just the inconsistency of the state and how it enforced certain laws would change literally and would just come in waves. So you could be wearing like what happened with Masa Gina Amini, you could be wearing your hijab one way and it would be fine. And then somebody just another time didn't like the look of it. Or you just don't have a sense of when, it's going to come crashing down on you. So by the time I left in the spring after there was a conservative wave was sort of brought elected in power, and I was able to see kind of very quickly things felt like they were changing, like closing down a bit. But I left before it got more rigid. Um, and then, my understanding was that there was a crackdown right after I left. And, and that was just part of the course. People just adjusted their behavior. And I think what has been interesting, what is interesting is seeing the toll, the sort of psychic toll that it's taken on people, generations of this, generations, decades of this, but yeah, generations of this too. And so I actually think that's one of the things that we're seeing is this generation, this Gen Z generation, doesn't have the experience of uh, the living through one revolution. They perhaps don't remember or have only heard in story the Iran-Iraq War and what that was like. And so I think what they have lived through is a different and very real trauma of living under this particular regime, and it's both its inconsistency and its brutality. And so I think it's a different level of anger and truly of a feeling of hopelessness that I think people are pushing against.
Speaking to that, do you mind if I ask you to speculate just a little bit on some thoughts that I'm having?
Oh yeah,
Okay, okay,
speculate.
okay.
I'm
Well, there's no way there's no other way to do it because you can't. There's no way for us in America to have the answer or to know what's
Mhm.
truly true. But I believe, I mean, you could probably make some great speculation. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask.
Great.
And what it is too is just the regime seems to be in many ways acting like a cornered animal, lashing out, with extreme cruelty toward the Iranian people. And that could be because there is a good probability that they will be overthrown. That could be why they're cracking down this hard, being
Mhm.
but do you know what kind of future the protesters have envisioned and what a regime change might look like, and also how they might want to try to keep another right-wing extremist group from trying to take advantage of a power vacuum if that were to occur again?
Um, these are all excellent questions that I
I,
will
I
truly
sorry, I feel like I really threw a lot at you all at once, and I didn't mean to.
no, I mean, I think mm, I'm just thinking through. So it's important to acknowledge that this uprising, revolution, however you want to say it, seems to be um, led horizontally. That is, there's no one leader. There's no um, one person at the top of the pyramid, whatever.
Yeah.
But it does seem to me that they are united by certain principles, which is sort of based in sort of progressive feminism, but also a progressive, there seems to be a real push um, for, you know, gender equality and parity, but also minority rights in a way that, like, in a country like Iran, hasn't really been acknowledged before. And so, if you're starting from those principles, then my hope is that those are the principles that are going to be followed through on. I think trumping those is obviously getting rid of the regime. I don't know, and somebody else who might have who studies the Middle East more in terms of like extremist groups, like would have a better sense of who already is in Iran. Um, but Iran, like Israel, is sort of an anomaly in the Middle East. I mean, it's not an Arab country, which makes it um, quite not quite different, but makes the threats a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a Shiite country, it's a Shiite majority country. So in that sense, I acknowledge that there isn't a clear leader, that there could potentially be a power vacuum. But I also, again, go back to the fact that we have no real idea of how people are organizing. We have a sense of it. We're guessing at parts of it. But, um, you know, my reporting leads me to believe that there are like it's a decentralized groups around the country um, that seem to be working in, organizing somehow. Um, but yeah, so and but going back to what you were saying about the regime acting like a cornered animal, the analogy that I've been using just to like play with each other's analogies a little bit is I have been talking about it as um, that moment when somebody is in an abusive relationship when they decide to leave. Because the most dangerous, as I think a lot of us know at this point, the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is when you're leaving, which is
Yeah.
why that's like the time when people, um, their lives are most at risk. And so I think that it is, it's incredibly dangerous right now, because the regime's entire reason for being is being, challenged. Um, and the the sort of coalitions that I'm seeing being built within the country, that I'm hearing about being built within the country, don't seem to be don't seem to have that right wing at this point that I've heard, that I've seen. That sort of um, hard right, hard line is what I'm trying to say, not hard right, hard line uh, belief systems, which I think is both a good thing, and then it can be a difficulty for building coalition, building um, systems, because it's much harder to build systems across groups. Um, but I also think that if one of the things that I have tried to become better at over the last few years especially covering all the stories that I've covered, is not leaning into the cynicism that comes with being 43 years old and covering politics for so long and covering news for a long period of time.
Yeah.
I think it's so easy to roll your eyes and assume that the worst will happen. Um, and it's much more difficult to look at things as they are and acknowledge that you don't know what's coming, and really lean in on what are like the complexity of outcomes that could happen, that
It's
aren't so black and white.
it's actually it's so interesting that you would say that you would bring up cynicism, because the I was actually going to go in the exact opposite direction.
Mhm.
And I've I think I've been maybe said, people have told me a few times in my life that I'm a little bit foolishly optimistic in some ways, but I don't think that's the case with what we're talking
Mhm.
about right now. And that what I was going to say is that I think that there are plenty of reasons to be hopeful. And I'm sure that there are just like thinking more for maybe like for us, where we're at, because we're not over there. We can't be on the ground with the people. But I'm sure there are many ways people outside of Iran can show support. And, let's just say to any listeners that aren't tech billionaires that could provide, Starlink satellite support or whatever, what is something helpful and meaningful that an average person can do?
I think it is incredibly helpful to do something as basic as really try to educate yourself. I mean, it depends, right? Like we have the spectrum of things.
Yeah.
I think educating yourselves, not letting, I think one of the things that's so refreshing, Doug, to hear you say that this is one of the biggest stories in the world right now, international stories in the world, because I felt disheartened by wondering whether people are paying attention to the story at all. And knowing how these kids are putting their lives in jeopardy. So I think educating yourself about both what's happening and also like, Iran was called the one of the axis of evil for so long, and we've as a country and as a society spent a lot of time trying to simplify a very complicated and beautiful and rich ancient, country that like also is deeply diverse and has its own set of, you know, yeah, complexities. So to get to know Iran at all, I think, or be curious about it at all is helpful. But I also think, it's really hard to know people want to donate money or something. I think there's some groups that are doing really interesting work with helping Iranians who are inside the country with mental health resources because it's a pretty bleak time inside the country.
Yeah.
Um, I'm sure if people know anything, they know that the, currency is almost worthless now. And so I think that if you can, there's some organizations that are doing that work, which I think is really helpful. And they are asking for donations. There are some smaller groups that are helping fund VPNs on a smaller level. Um, and then I would, write your representatives, write your congressmen and your senators, have them, I think the more pressure can be put on the regime to stop the executions, to let prisoners go free, to allow people to do journalism in the country.
Yeah.
Those are things that I think international pressure can actually be really good on. And I am somebody who believes that we should have people inside of Iran that can be, special raconteurs from the UN or I think working in a vacuum, having Iran operate with, you know, carte blanche and vacuum is really scary for me. But I'm a journalist and I always think more information is better than less. So, I think really clear steps is, educating yourself, finding groups like mental health care groups that are working trying to work within the country through workshops or providing some sort of online resources, people who are supporting people in Iran by keeping VPNs or other tech services open, smaller groups. I would, tech billionaires aside. And
I can't let a single episode go by without taking a jab at Lord Elon. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. I mean, the fact that he was able to try to do something good and ended up, doing a dumb thing is
it's really on brand for him.
Truly. And then, yeah, we have a representative republic. So call on your lawmakers. And then, on a smaller level, if you know any Iranians, maybe just reach out to them. It's a hard time for us.
Yeah.
We're all struggling a bit.
I will then. I will absolutely do that. That's one thing I feel like I think that's what I was trying to get at is things, because I believe that hope is one of the most powerful forces that exists. And that's why I didn't want to end this on a note where we're like, the brutality or these, it's it's the same thing I feel about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Is that people become very what I call climate doomers. I didn't make that up. I heard it somewhere and then I just adopted it. And and it's like people that are like, it's too late, can't do anything about it. Drive your Hummer, dump your oil into a lake full of ducks, and it's just and I'm like, no, that's not be a try to find how you can make a positive change, even if it's small. There's if there's enough of us and there's enough hope, things can change. And I think that you can apply that to more than one thing. I often apply it to climate change, animal conservation. These are things I work in a lot, but with the Iranian people, the protesters, keeping hope alive, making sure that their stories are being heard, all around. And who knows, it could be the kind of thing where some tech billionaire decides they want to score some points and be popular again and goes and does the right thing for once. Or
totally.
Yeah. Or I mean, I was gonna make a dumb joke. I was gonna say, or maybe Jake Gyllenhaal makes another Prince of Persia, but this one they put Maggie Gyllenhaal and call it the Princess of Persia.
Maybe I heard some Iranian actors.
I know. I brought that up because that's kind of considered one of the worst whitewashing films
my God, yeah,
of all time. I mean, since I guess Lawrence of Arabia was pretty, but anyway, here's the thing. What I wanted to say, also, just because I am this hopeful and I do believe this is gonna, the tide is gonna go the right way, and I wanted to say that maybe a little bit down the road, when the protesters have succeeded and there is a regime change and women have regained their rights and they can wear whatever they want and they can get educated however they want and they can sit on any seat on the bus they want, maybe then we could celebrate by you could come back on the podcast and we can do a movie review of Jake Gyllenhaal's Prince of Persia and make fun of it, and that could be a celebration episode.
Oh my God, I love that. Can we do that in 300? Which
I forgot about 300. Okay, that's a double feature. All right, guys,
you heard, I love it.
You heard it here first. Once when the people of Iran have succeeded and the protests have succeeded, and hope has prevailed, we will be seriously talking some shit over Prince of Persia and 300.
Perfect. So come on, everybody, let's get this revolution moving.
Look, if you weren't motivated before, you should be motivated now.
I mean, absolutely.
Neda, I have to ask you one last question. It's probably the most important question of the day. It's hard to say that I asked some important questions, but this is where can people find your work? Like, where can they read what you write? Where can they find your book? Just
Oh,
everything.
oh my goodness. Well, you can follow me around the internet on Twitter and Instagram, Neda_Semnani on both. I haven't updated my website, but in theory, you can find almost everything that I've written there. And then the book is available anywhere. Ask your local bookstore if they'll order it if they're not carrying it, or go on bookshop.org, or Amazon. It's great too. I mean, whatever. And then otherwise, yeah, drop me a note, say hi. I'm friendly.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, Doug, thank you so much. I talked so much.
And
We've been on.
but I learned so much, and that was the goal.
Okay, good.